June 4, 1942. Coral Sea. Over the bright blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the sun reflected off the endless waves, dazzling like a million scattered mirrors. Above, formations of Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0s sliced through the sky, their engines a high-pitched whine that seemed to mock the inexperienced American pilots below. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a seasoned Zero pilot, grinned behind his goggles as he scanned the horizon. "These Americans fly tin cans," he muttered. "We will dance circles around them before they even see us." Below, a handful of Grumman F4F Wildcats roared to life on the horizon, engines snarling with determined ferocity. Lieutenant Robert Bob Hansen, a young but confident U.S. Navy pilot, tightened his grip on the control stick. Saltwater spray stung his goggles as he angled the plane into formation, the metal frame vibrating under the throttle's full force. Beside him, Ensign Charlie Reeves called out over the radio, his voice tense but steady. "Looks like the Zeros are already banking. They know we're here." The first encounter was almost theatrical. The Zeros, sleek and nimble, swooped in with dazzling speed, attempting to spiral around the Wildcats in graceful, predatory arcs. Their confidence was palpable. Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to dominating the skies. In previous engagements, any American fighter they faced had buckled under their superior maneuverability. Hansen felt the sting of initial panic as a Zero flashed past his wingtip, missing him by mere feet. The Japanese pilot's laughter crackled faintly through the radio, though. It was likely his squadron mates. Hansen shook his head, forcing his pulse to settle. "Stay calm. Stick to the plan. Watch your six." What the Japanese didn't know, what no one had anticipated, was that the Wildcat had hidden advantages. Its heavier armor and robust airframe allowed it to dive sharply without tearing apart. It could absorb hits that would cripple a Zero. And most importantly, American pilots had recently begun experimenting with a coordinated defensive tactic, the Thach Weave, where two Wildcats would support each other, turning their supposed disadvantage in maneuverability into a trap. As the first volleys of 7.7 mm and .50 caliber rounds exchanged across the sky, Hansen dove, banking sharply. The Zero followed, expecting the Wildcat to falter, but the American plane held. Reeves, his partner, twisted his plane in a counter-arc, forcing a pursuing Zero to overshoot. With a quick, precise burst from his wing-mounted guns, Hansen found his target. Sparks flew, metal groaned, and the Zero spiraled down into the ocean below. A moment of silence hung in the formation, then Hansen's voice rang clear over the comm. "One down. Keep your heads." The Japanese pilots, once cocky and laughing, now felt unease prick at their confidence. Their dance, which had seemed effortless for years, was meeting resistance. The Wildcats were heavier, yes, less nimble, but they were smart, coordinated, and deadly in dives where the Zeros could not follow safely. From the deck of an American carrier below, officers watched through binoculars, noting the first cracks in the myth of Zero supremacy. Commander Samuel B. Lawson, veteran of early Pacific engagements, muttered under his breath, "They think they're untouchable. They haven't met the Wildcat yet." As the sky filled with spiraling fighters, the lesson became painfully clear to both sides. Agility alone was no longer enough. The Wildcats, rugged and methodically flown, were beginning to turn the tide. Hansen, panting but steady, scanned the horizon for the next attacker. "Remember the weave! Watch your partner!" Above them, the Zeros continued to bank and dive, but the air had changed. Mockery had given way to tension. Confidence had begun to falter. The once feared Japanese ace pilots were realizing that the dance they had perfected for years might no longer guarantee victory. And at that moment in the bright heat of the Pacific, the F4F Wildcat had announced its presence. Not as a mere tin can, but as a fighter that could and would outmaneuver the legendary Zero in the ways that truly mattered. The morning sky over the Coral Sea shimmered with heat and tension. Smoke from previous dogfights hung faintly near the horizon, twisting in thin spirals that betrayed where planes had fallen into the water. Lieutenant Hansen and Ensign Reeves, flying side by side, adjusted their formation as another wave of Zeros appeared, sleek silhouettes glinting in the tropical sun. This time the Japanese pilots were cocky but cautious. They had witnessed the Wildcats take a kill, and that hesitation, subtle though it was, gave the Americans an opening. Hansen felt it as a moment of clarity, a rhythm emerging from the chaos. "We don't match them in turns," he said over the radio. "We hit them where it counts. Dive fast, trade fire, then pull up and let your partner cover." Behind him, Ensign Reeves executed the Thach Weave, banking sharply as a Zero followed. The maneuver, taught only weeks before, relied on two planes working in tandem. One lured the pursuer into an overshoot, while the other moved into firing position. As the Zero followed Reeves too closely, Hansen fired a controlled burst. The Japanese plane shuddered under the impact, trailing smoke as it spiraled downward into the endless blue. High above, Lieutenant Tanaka felt a cold prickle of unease. He had been confident in the Zero's legendary maneuverability, certain that American pilots would fall behind in the turn. But each encounter revealed a pattern. The Wildcat could dive harder, sustain hits, and fight smartly in coordinated pairs. Its pilots weren't just reacting, they were anticipating. Below, the American carrier deck crews watched with wide eyes. Marines adjusted anti-aircraft guns, officers scribbled reports, but all were aware of a subtle shift. The balance in the sky was changing. The Wildcat, long dismissed as inferior, was proving it could survive and win against the fabled Zero. Hansen dove sharply, letting gravity accelerate the Wildcat's fuselage as the plane screamed toward the ocean. His guns flared and another Zero began to break apart, metal twisting against the air. The adrenaline surged, but his focus never wavered. "Keep moving. Don't let them pin you," Reeves called back over the radio, voice tight with tension. "I've got your 6, take him!" The teamwork was seamless, almost instinctive. This wasn't individual heroics. It was methodical, calculated, and deadly. Japanese pilots who had once mocked the Americans now found themselves reacting defensively, struggling to adjust to tactics they hadn't faced before. Tanaka banked sharply, trying to shake off Reeves, but the Wildcat's durability made every attack costly. A glance to the side revealed Hansen already maneuvering into position, wings leveled, guns ready. Another controlled burst, another Zero descending into the vast blue ocean. The sky was alive with speed, smoke, and the glint of metal, but the rhythm had shifted. The Americans were no longer the prey. They had learned the dance, and now they dictated the tempo. On the carriers below, Commander Lawson scribbled in his log. "Wildcats are proving that durability, diving advantage, and coordinated tactics can counter Zero superiority. This is a turning point in aerial strategy." Above them, the Japanese formation wavered. Confidence faltered. The myth of the untouchable Zero was cracking, and for the first time, seasoned aviators felt uncertainty creep into their calculations. As Hansen leveled out after another successful pass, he glanced at Reeves and allowed himself a brief, grim smile. This is working," he said. And above the Coral Sea, the long-feared Zeros were beginning to realize that mocking the Wildcat had been a dangerous mistake. By midday, the ocean below shimmered with the aftermath of multiple dogfights. White caps hid pieces of metal and floating debris, while smoke trails arced through the sky like ghostly fingers marking where the Zeros had been sent plummeting into the sea. Lieutenant Hansen adjusted his headset, sweat streaking his face as another squadron of Japanese fighters appeared over the horizon. Their formation was tighter now, more cautious, but still deadly. "Everyone stay sharp," Hansen barked over the radio. "Keep the weave tight. Don't let them surprise you." Ensign Reeves leaned forward, scanning the approaching planes. "They're faster in level flight," he muttered. "But they can't match us in dives anymore." The Wildcat's hidden advantage was becoming undeniable. Its robust airframe allowed pilots to dive sharply without losing control or risking structural failure, a maneuver Zeros couldn't safely follow at full speed. And while the Japanese fighters relied on superior agility in turns, the Americans used the Thach Weave to turn that strength into a trap. As the first Zero came barreling in, Reeves executed the weave perfectly. Hansen dove, disappearing beneath the Zero's flight path only to reappear behind the pursuing aircraft. His guns fired, metal shredding the enemy plane's wing, sending it into a spiraling descent. Another Wildcat mirrored the maneuver, ensuring that no Zero could escape without exposure. Lieutenant Tanaka felt panic rise. The Americans weren't just surviving, they were controlling the engagement. The dance he and his fellow pilots had perfected over years of training now felt like a trap. Each turn, each attack seemed anticipated. Each dive met with a lethal counter. From the carrier decks below, gunners and officers watched with growing amazement. Commander Samuel Lawson's notes grew longer, meticulous with observations. Wildcats are systematically exploiting dive speed and armor advantage. Zero superiority is diminishing. Coordinated American tactics are changing the engagement dynamic. The fight became a whirlwind of motion. Wildcats sliced through the sky in tandem, trading position, covering each other, diving on Zeros that once mocked them. One by one, Japanese planes faltered under the new strategy. Smoke trailed the once pristine wings of the A-6Ms, their pilots scrambling to recover. Hansen's Wildcat was dented and scraped from minor hits, but it remained intact. The plane's rugged construction allowed him to fly with confidence even as bullets stitched through the fuselage. Reeves called out, "Another one going down?" The Japanese squadron's cohesion broke under sustained attacks. Pilots who had entered the fight with smirks now dove for evasive maneuvers, retreating in unison when their formation began to fragment. Lieutenant Tanaka, wide-eyed, realized this was no fluke. The Wildcat wasn't just defending, it was dominating. Hansen leveled his aircraft, surveying the remnants of the enemy formation. Smoke streaked the sky. A few Zeros banked desperately, attempting to escape. He glanced at Reeves, who mirrored his grin. "They thought they could dance around us," Hansen said, voice steady despite adrenaline. "Now they know better." Above the Coral Sea, the shift was undeniable. Japanese pilots, once confident in their aerial supremacy, now faced an opponent they had underestimated. And American aviators, through ingenuity, teamwork, and the rugged Wildcat, had begun to rewrite the rules of dogfighting in the Pacific. The first clear victory of the day wasn't just measured in planes downed. It was measured in confidence regained, in fear instilled in a once dominant enemy, and in the dawning realization that the Wildcat mocked and underestimated could fight on equal terms. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was crumbling, one dive and one weave at a time. As the sun climbed higher, the Coral Sea became a theater of relentless motion. Wildcats swooped and dived, engines snarling, leaving trails of spray and exhaust above the shimmering waves. Lieutenant Hansen adjusted his goggles against the salt and glare, scanning for any sign of approaching Zeros. "What makes this plane special?" Ensign Reeves asked over the radio, voice strained but exhilarated. "It's not as nimble as the Zero, yet it's holding them off." Hansen tightened his grip on the stick. "It's all about the dive and armor. And remember the Thach Weave. We turn their strength into a weakness." The Zeros were built for agility, turning in tight circles and outmaneuvering almost any Allied fighter in horizontal combat. But their lightweight frames were fragile. One burst from the Wildcats. 50 caliber guns could cripple a Zero that relied on speed and nimbleness to survive. Meanwhile, the Wildcat's robust design allowed pilots to push the plane to extremes without catastrophic failure. Hansen and Reeves executed dive after dive, coordinating attacks like a deadly ballet. A Zero took the bait, following Reeves in a sharp turn, only to overshoot as Hansen twisted beneath it. Bullets tore into its wing, and the pilot, panic evident even from high above, tried desperately to recover, but the dive speed advantage of the Wildcat ensured he had no escape. Across the sky, Lieutenant Tanaka and his fellow Japanese pilots felt the sting of the Wildcat's hidden weapons: tactical coordination and engineering resilience. The Americans were teaching them a lesson that raw agility alone could not convey. Confidence faltered, replaced by a creeping tension as they struggled to predict the Wildcat's movements. From the decks of American carriers, officers and deck crews tracked the aerial ballet with growing amazement. Commander Samuel Lawson's notes reflected both relief and fascination. The Wildcats exploit dive capability, defensive teamwork, and structural durability. Japanese pilots' confidence begins to waver under sustained, precise attacks. Meanwhile, Hansen's Wildcat shuddered from a grazing bullet to the fuselage, but he barely noticed. Every movement had become instinct. Lure the enemy in, dive, let your partner cover, and strike. The combination of disciplined tactics and aircraft resilience allowed a handful of Wildcats to hold their own against larger squadrons of Zeros. A brief lull in the battle allowed Hansen to glance across the horizon. Zeros circled at a distance, hesitating now, calculating risk where before they had attacked with cocky abandon. The psychological shift was as important as any physical victory in the sky. "You see that hesitation?" Hansen radioed to Reeves. "That's the difference. They know they can't just outturn us anymore." Reeves nodded, eyes scanning the sky. "And we're only getting started." By mid-afternoon, the pattern was clear. The Wildcat, previously mocked by the enemy, had transformed from a defensive afterthought into a formidable predator. Dive speed, armor, and tactical teamwork had leveled the playing field, forcing the once dominant Zeros into a reactive, uncertain stance. Lieutenant Tanaka, circling at the rear of his formation, realized with dawning alarm that his aircraft and training were no longer sufficient. The Wildcats had rewritten the rules of engagement. And in the brutal calculus of aerial warfare, survival now required adaptation or death. The sky above the Coral Sea was no longer dominated by the legend of the Zero. It belonged, in that moment, to the Wildcat and to the pilots who had learned to make the most of every ounce of its hidden strength. As the afternoon wore on, the Coral Sea sky was a tapestry of motion planes weaving, diving, and streaking across the bright blue expanse. Lieutenant Hansen and Ensign Reeves, flying in perfect coordination, felt the rhythm of battle settle into something almost mechanical. Every maneuver was calculated, every attack deliberate, every dive exploiting the Wildcats' hidden advantages. Lieutenant Tanaka and the remaining Japanese pilots were no longer attacking with confidence. Their earlier bravado had eroded into hesitation and doubt. One by one, Zeros faltered under the relentless pressure of the Wildcats' coordinated assaults. Smoke trailed from damaged wings, and desperate evasive maneuvers could no longer guarantee survival. Hansen glanced at Reeves. "This is it. Keep the weave tight. Finish the pattern." They dove, looping in perfect synchrony, a deadly trap that left a Zero pursuing Reeves in their crosshairs. A burst of gunfire erupted, tearing through metal and fabric. The enemy aircraft spiraled downward, leaving a trail of smoke across the ocean. Another Zero tried to break off, but the Wildcats anticipated every turn, forcing it into a dive it could not survive. The air over the Coral Sea had changed. Where once the Zeros had ruled unchallenged, the Wildcats now dictated the battle. Pilots who had mocked the Americans and their tin cans now faced the reality. The Wildcat could outmaneuver them in dives, absorb hits, and most importantly kill with precision through teamwork. On the carrier decks, officers and crew watched the sky with growing admiration. Commander Samuel Lawson scribbled in his notes, "The Wildcat, combined with the Thach Weave, has transformed defensive capability into offensive supremacy. The myth of Zero invincibility is shattered." As the last of the Japanese fighters retreated toward the horizon, Lieutenant Hansen felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. His plane bore scratches and dents, but it had performed flawlessly. Reeves, beside him, let out a long breath. "We actually did it," he said. A faint smile breaking through, Hansen nodded. "We did, and the enemy knows it now." For the Japanese pilots, the lesson was stark and humbling. The F4F Wildcat, once underestimated, often mocked, had proven itself capable of defeating the legendary Zero in skilled hands. Its pilots had turned durability, diving advantage, and tactical innovation into lethal weapons. In the broader war effort, this engagement marked a turning point in aerial combat in the Pacific. Confidence in the Zero's invincibility was shaken, and American pilots gained a new sense of possibility. The Wildcat's success was not only a triumph of engineering but of strategy, coordination, and the relentless courage of those who flew it. High above the Coral Sea, the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the waves. Wildcats and their pilots returned to carriers, engines roaring, triumphant, but already prepared for the next engagement. The battle had been won, but more importantly, the psychological advantage had shifted. The Japanese pilots, who had once mocked the Wildcat, would now respect and fear it. And the Americans, flying in these rugged, steadfast planes, knew that the tide of the Pacific War was slowly beginning to turn in their favor. The F4F Wildcat had earned its place in history, not through beauty or speed alone, but through the cunning, resilience, and determination of the pilots who refused to be outmaneuvered.